First, some general information. At the census, the population was about 2.7 million people. It's the third largest city in the US, and that represents some slight population growth since 2010. The metro population is over 9 million people, and that includes the northwestern corner of Indiana. It's the third largest metro in the US, behind only New York and Los Angeles, and the fourth largest combined metro in the US, also behind the DC-Baltimore area. The state of Illinois gets a lot of bad press, and Chicago gets a lot of bad press too. And with Illinois being one of only 2 states that lost population between the 2010 and 2020 censuses, a lot of folks believe that Chicago is the reason for the population decline. This map breaks Illinois down by counties. The counties highlighted in green gained population between the last 2 censuses, and the counties highlighted in purple are the ones that lost population. So as you can see here, all of the counties of Metro Chicago, which is often referred to as Chicagoland, have gained population, and most of the rural counties in the state are the ones losing population. I don't normally break down cities by race and ethnicity, but for Chicago it's very interesting. It's approximately 30% each white, Hispanic, and black. And there's also a sizable Asian population at 7%. A good majority of the Hispanic population in Chicago is of Mexican origin. Many people from Mexico moved to Chicago in the early 20th century to do largely unskilled type labor. And in the years since, the Mexican population has been a big part of the identity of the city. Much of the black population moved from the South in the early 20th century as part of what is called the Great Migration. A lot of black people in the South moved to the northern cities to get away from Jim Crow and to get factory jobs. Many of these employers in these factories up north wouldn't hire them. So as a result, you had a large number of poor black folks clustered in specific neighborhoods. And because the cycle of poverty is so difficult to escape, there are still several neighborhoods in the city that are predominantly black and predominantly very poor. The city is divided up into 77 community areas, each of which has a distinct feel. And that's one of the things that I like the most about Chicago, is the fact that you have all these little community areas in one big city. The heart of the city, the central business district, is often referred to as the Loop. It sits along the lakeshore and is essentially halfway between the northern and southern ends of the city. Running right through the heart of the city is the Chicago River, and the area along here is where you see some really fantastic views, wonderful skyscrapers on both sides of the river. And you've probably seen photos of when they dump a bunch of green dye in the river for St. Patrick's Day, but the river is already kind of green anyway. At the south end of downtown along the lakeshore is where you have the museum campus. And as you might expect, there's a lot of museums there. Natural history, the planetarium, aquarium, and this is also where you have the large convention center and Soldier Field, which is where the Chicago Bears play. Toward the north end of downtown along the lakeshore is the Navy Pier. This is where the Children's Museum is and some amusement park rides, and it is very touristy, but there's also some outdoor green space for concerts and other outdoor events that locals will go to. And all of these things that I just mentioned downtown are within walking distance of each other, and I spent the entirety of my first day there just walking around downtown. There's a nice walking and biking path along the lake connecting the museum campus and the Navy Pier, but even more interesting is just walking the various streets of downtown. One of the most iconic things about walking around downtown Chicago are the L trains. So as a visitor, it's just kind of cool to see these trains clanking along these elevator rail lines at a speed just a little more than you can walk. So the Loop is definitely the heart and soul of Chicago, but there are many other great neighborhoods in the city as well. Parts of town north of downtown are referred to as the North Side, and parts of town south of downtown are the South Side. For the most part, the North Side is middle class or wealthy, but there are some pockets of poverty even in the North Side. And the North Side is where you have more of the cool, trendy, fun type neighborhoods, more of the gentrification of older neighborhoods. North of downtown along the lakeshore is Wrigleyville, which is the part of town where you have Wrigley Field where the Chicago Cubs play. And this is just a really fun part of town, a lot of sports-themed bars and restaurants. You'll see people at these bars pre-gaming it before they go to the stadium. For folks that are not going to the stadium itself to watch the game, there'll be a lot of people in the restaurants and bars in this part of town watching the game there. And although I wasn't there after a game, I'm pretty sure there'll be people in the bars drinking after the game as well. But some of my favorite neighborhoods in the city are on the north side, but not along the lakeshore. One of them is called Andersonville, and historically this was a part of town where many Swedish immigrants moved to. You have the Swedish American Museum located in this neighborhood, and there's been some gentrification here as well. A lot of cool local restaurants and bars. Some good boutique shops, a good record store, and it's not really a touristy part of town, it's very locals oriented. Also in this general part of the city is a part of town called Avondale, and this is where you had a large Polish immigrant community. And you can still see lots of Polish heritage on display, including the world-famous Kurowski sausage shop. You ask people who the sausage king of Chicago is, and most will say Abe Froman, but it's actually Kurowski. Also in this part of the city is the Logan Square neighborhood. This is another kind of cool and hip, recently gentrified type neighborhood. Up until about 20 years ago or so, there was a large Mexican population living in this part of town. But with a lot of gentrification, a lot of the Mexican population moved to other parts of the city, many into the northwestern corner of the city, which is near O'Hare Airport. And so as you can imagine, the northwestern corner of the city, near the fourth busiest airport in the world, is not going to have the highest real estate values. But even though the north side is generally wealthier than the south side, arguably the poorest part of town and the highest crime part of town is in the north side. It's the area around the neighborhoods West Garfield Park and Austin. And I'm not going to be like the media and sensationalize or overemphasize the parts of town that really do have high crime and much gang activity and problems with drugs. But nonetheless, there are several neighborhoods that face some of these really high crime problems. For the most part, the south side is poorer and has higher crime than the north side, but that doesn't mean that the entire south side is this high crime poor area. With that being said, the south centralist part of the city is where you have the largest concentration of some of these big high crime neighborhoods. And the two neighborhoods in this part of town having the highest crime rates and the highest amount of gang activity are called Greater Grand Crossing and Inglewood. But when you get to the southeast part of the city, mainly along the lakeshore, it's mostly middle class, some rich folks there as well, and overall it's just a nice part of town. And the southwestern corner of the city is just kind of working class, middle class folks as well. The southeast part of the city is where you have a lot of predominantly black middle class neighborhoods. Although the richest folks in Chicago, regardless of race, are probably going to be living in the northeastern corner of the city, some of those giant mansions near the lakeshore. Editorializing about some of the high crime areas and the number of shootings is well beyond the scope of this channel, but from a geography standpoint, I can tell you that it is not most of the city that is like that. And as a geographer, it's just so frustrating to see the media be so successful in their depiction of the city. It's literally successful propaganda, as millions of Americans genuinely believe that the majority of Chicago is like some of these high crime, poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Just southwest of downtown is Chinatown, and just like many other big cities in the country, a large Chinese immigrant population moved to the part of town that eventually became known as Chinatown. Just south of that is an area called Bridgeport, and as the number of Chinese immigrants grew in the city, many moved farther south into this neighborhood, and now this neighborhood is being gentrified into more of a cool hipster type neighborhood. The GDP of Cook County alone is $345 billion, which is more than 28 states, several of which have more people. And despite many people leaving the state of Illinois, companies like to move to Chicago. In fact, for the decade of the 2010s, Chicago was the #1 city in the country for corporate relocation. And there are many major companies headquartered there, including Boeing Aircraft, McDonald's, Walgreens, Kraft Heinz, and many others. And I think a big reason for companies wanting to be located in Chicago is the relatively low cost of operation there. And part of the reason for housing costs being relatively low there is because the property taxes are so high, people aren't willing to pay as much for the house itself when the taxes are going to be so high. Some of these less expensive neighborhoods might be a fine neighborhood, but you might not be able to walk around very far before you get to neighborhoods where you might not want to be walking around. But once you get up into the 300,000 range, which crazy enough is pretty cheap these days, you can get some really nice housing in really good parts of town. You're not getting houses like this in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Denver, DC, or Boston for these prices. So that's just one more reason to like Chicago. Now I want to talk about some of the iconic foods of Chicago. The most iconic is deep dish pizza. And I really like deep dish pizza, although I think it's unfairly compared to New York style pizza. You really need to be in the mood more for like an Italian meal or a lasagna if you want a deep dish pizza. The city is also known for Italian beef sandwiches, and this is a pot roast beef cooked with beef stock instead of au jus. And with the city being known for having a lot of sausage, it's also well known for having Chicago-style hot dogs. However, to me, these things look awful, and I'll take your word on it if you like them. I love pickles, but on a hot dog? What's wrong with you people? So overall, I really like Chicago, and I'm not afraid to call it my favorite big city in the country. All kinds of cultural attractions and urban amenities, lots of green space, a few really big parks, and a whole bunch of smaller ones. Beaches along the lakeshore, one of the best food scenes in the entire country, one of the best music scenes in the entire country, and a relatively low cost of living, especially compared to other big cities in the country. In walking around town, I talked to a bunch of people, asked them what they thought about Chicago, and the answers were basically unanimous. I love Chicago, except I hate the winters, and F the news media. And so as a visitor who's been there several times, I have to echo that sentiment. I love Chicago, except I hate those winters, and F the news media. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and consider subscribing to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography. I'm talking about cities like this, also going over states, ranking things in all kinds of different categories, talking about cross-country road tripping. I'm a bit of a nerd, so everything comes from a little more nerdy type perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching.